You're listening to the School of Hard Knock Knocks podcast with me, Maury Morgan.
Ladies and gentlemen, your next comedian.
Shouldn't drink on an empty head, you know that, don't you?
That is the shittiest heckle I have ever heard in my life.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
What's a bucket list?
You have dangerously underprepared yourself for the shit that is about to get real.
Glynn Nicholas is a comedy genius in performing, writing and producing. Made famous by his regular appearances on the ABC's The Big Gig and shortly after in his own time slot with The Glynn Nicholas Show, this is a man who can see the funny in even the most poignant and stressful situations. That's why he believes the role of performing comedy is one of the most important jobs in the world. In this School of Hard Knock Knocks podcast episode, we talk about Glynn's initiation into comedy through busking, how being in the right place at the right time got him into TV, his recent comedy stage shows and advice for up-and-coming comedians. And we have exciting news. If you'd like to get personally coached in comedy by Glynn Nicholas himself, then sign up to the September 24 to 28 stand-up comedy workshop in Melbourne. The past 3 workshops have been sold out, so be quick. And now here he is, Glynn Nicholas. Good afternoon, Glynn. How are you?
Oh, good day, Maury. I'm well. How are you, mate?
Oh, very good, very good. We are on the phone together, but we probably only live about 3 or 4 kilometres from one another in the inner eastern suburbs of Melbourne.
Lovely area.
Yeah, it is. It is. Although I don't know if you can hear that wind outside. It is a windy day on.
Yeah, I was running around Albert Park this morning and nearly got blown into the water. It was that strong. Yeah.
Yeah. I might have seen you. Well, fantastic. Well, Glynn, look, this is an honour to speak to you because I was a big fan of The Big Gig, and of course, I think you started your TV career in Australia on The Big Gig, if I'm not mistaken.
Pretty much. Although I did work with Humphrey Bear when I was younger, but it was the first time I sort of went out to an adult audience, and that was quite an experience, being live and all. Yeah. And then you went on and had your own show, named show, Glynn Nicholas Show. I did. That's right, I did. For my sins. Sean McAuliffe and I wrote that series.
Yep.
But The Big Gig was the show that kind of broke, I suppose, a lot of new ground in Australian TV. It was live.
Yep.
And the likes of the Doug Anthony All-Stars, Wendy Harmer, Anthony Aykroyd, Gene Kitson, Empty Pockets, and so on. That was our sort of, I guess you could say it was really our big break in terms of national recognition.
Yep.
And the beautiful thing about that show was because it was live, there was, you just had to sort of get it right. But everyone had come from a live performing background, either performing in the streets or performing in clubs and comedy rooms and so on. So when stuff did get stuffed up, when things did go wrong, we were mostly able to deal with it. And the producer and director, Ted Robinson, did a great job of sort of making that, I guess you could call it almost a sort of bit of a scary element work.
Yeah.
And all the crew, of course, were all very good. They were really on their toes.
Yep.
And it was quite a memorable series, or I think we did 2 or 3 series altogether.
Yep. So it was almost like a concert in that anything could happen. The audience could storm the stage because it was live.
They could, and they could. And we had a few guest acts on who sort of used the fact that there was no sort of safety net. They used it to their advantage or disadvantage. And it was fantastic. And it's a lot of people, when I speak to them, they recall The Big Gig with a lot of fond memories. And they just said there was something about that show that just was really exciting to watch.
Yeah, it was raw, wasn't it? It was in your face and not manicured and not polished like a lot of the stuff we'd seen before.
Yeah, and also the way that the construct of it, like the style of it, like the audience were everywhere. They were right up close to the performers. They were, so the audience in the room was part of the gig. When people came in, I always remember people coming into the studio because it was a tiny studio. They were, oh, God, it looks so much bigger on telly.
Yeah.
But that's the way that they designed it. Des White was the designer. He put mirrors up everywhere. So the room looked huge, but the great thing from a performer's point of view was that the audience were literally could reach out and touch them.
Yeah, and you did often.
We did.
Yeah, I've seen some reruns.
Yeah.
well, let's go back and go back into the origins of Glynn Nicholas, because that, as you just described, that performance live in front of an audience is where you came from. Born in the UK, specifically, I think you were born in England, but then moved to Wales, Cardiff.
Yeah, my parents moved and I tracked them down.
Very good.
I was actually born in Bristol.
In Bristol.
Yeah. So that's where I was born. But then I was pretty much raised in when I was a younger kid, just outside. Well, in London, just in Harrow.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I turned 10, I think it was, or 9 or 10, we moved to Wales. And I spent from that age until I came to Australia. So 10 years I spent in Wales.
Yep.
And
and you were 20 when you arrived in Australia.
That's right. Yeah, I just came out kind of on a whim. Yep. I wasn't quite sure why I decided. I was one of the last of the 10-pound Poms to come out.
Oh, good. Good. And you came over, then now this is where I wasn't sure. I did some research on you in your early days, in your 20s. Now you came over to Australia, but it wasn't until you were in Europe. So you went back to you went to Europe,
yes,
where you discovered busking. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I had I worked in Australia. You name a job, I did it. One of the jobs I had was to worked at Arnott's. My job to break the first biscuit in every packet.
Yeah, okay.
But I did. I worked. Seriously, you name a job, and I probably did it. So that was in the days when you could get jobs relatively easy. I did it, and that way I travelled quite a lot. Worked on a lot of farms and so on, and in factories and bus conductor and all that. And then after 6 years, I went back to Europe to have a look around Europe, and I went to the Oktoberfest, and that's where I saw my first busker. And it was, looking back, it was actually probably the first live performance that I ever witnessed, because none of my family really were into going to the theatre or anything like that. And I was mesmerised. And then I went down to Crete. I was going to spend the summer there, ran out of money and ended up spending half the winter there. And that's where I met a Scots guy called Miller, and he always had money. And I thought, clearly he's a drug dealer, but turns out he was a busker. Right. And so he taught me how to play the 3 busking songs that you need, which is Blowing in the Wind and the other 2. And then I said to him, well, where's the place to go to make money busking? And he said, Germany. Turns out the place to make big money was Switzerland, which is where he went. But
right.
Doesn't matter. I went to Germany and fell in love with Munich. Because on the way, while I was at the Oktoberfest, I actually saw this guy busking, a guy called Phil, who was known as the Pope of the buskers. And he just had this sweetest little show where he would play. It took him maybe 20 minutes to sing one song. Yeah. His interaction with the audience was incredible, and I was absolutely mesmerized by him. Yeah. And so when I came back, I befriended Phil, and he sort of mentored me in the busking and how important the connection with the audience was. And,
Phil doesn't sound like a typical German name. I assume he wasn't.
No, he was English. He was an English guy. He's from Yorkshire, and he played the banjo and ukulele. Yep. But he was the sweetest performer, and audiences just loved him, And so I have a lot of gratitude to Phil for what he taught me.
Yeah, and you had a fair bit of competition. All buskers have a fair bit of competition to get the attention. I believe you had some tricks, and I wasn't able to find out what some of those tricks were. But could you share one of them with our audience today?
Oh, for sure. I mean, getting the audience is actually the tricky part. If you imagine, and this is one of the things I often want to, when I see buskers, I want to sort of say, I have this idea for a program about going around the world, working with buskers, giving them a few ideas about how to get a crowd and how to get the money. That's what I was good with. But in order to get people's attention, you need to be doing something. My style was very low-key, sort of almost, you wouldn't hardly notice that I was doing a show, but sometimes I would do the traditional following people, but then particularly in Germany, I would block people. So, for example, if a person was walking down what they call the mall, the Fußgängerzone, which was all pedestrian crossing, but I'd pretend that I'd see something on the floor just in front of them, and I'd use my peripheral vision to block them whilst pretending to look at something. And that used to get them cross, and then often they, push me over or push me out the way. But people would notice that, and then gradually more and more people would just see what I was going to do next. So it was really just playing with passers-by until there was enough of an audience, and then I'd gather them in, and then I'd do a little something with the audience to create more of a crowd. And it was and some of the things that I used to do, I look back on now and I thought, well, that was pretty weird. For example, if in Adelaide, when I had a crowd of, say, 300 or so, which was not an uncommon thing, I would say to the audience, listen, I'm just going to leave. I want you all now to imagine that there's a little invisible mouse performing here. And I would stand and be one of the audience, but they would all be looking at where the mouse was supposed to be, but using their peripheral vision to watch me as well. Yeah. So that when I cheered or when I booed or when I, gasped with wonder, they would all do the same. And then new people who came to the crowd were wondering what the hell's going on, Right. There's nothing going on here, but everyone's laughing.
Emperor's new clothes.
Yeah. And so it was great fun to play with the audience. And I think that sort of, it's a loving the audience rather than wanting to conquer the audience. That's what I learned from that, so that when we're doing the big gig, I never said or used language like I'm going to go out there and kill. I just said, look, I'm going to go out there and, sort of work with my friends, because most audiences do want you to do well. And that's what a lot of people forget. They get so concerned about conquering, they forget to love. And that's what I think good performance is. It's a mutual back and forth of love.
Yeah, right. Well, we take it a couple of years forward, and the Doug Anthony All-Stars, who also started as buskers in the streets of Canberra, Tim Ferguson I actually interviewed for this podcast early on. Did they ask you to be a support act, or was this for the big gig, or was it prior to the big gig? How did you get involved with DAS?
Well, coincidentally, it was just before the big gig started, but the Dougs had a bit more of a profile. I was more of the Adelaide-based busker, and there was a show going on. It was the inaugural cabaret festival in Adelaide years ago, and I was approached to be, I guess it was the support for the Dougs, and Mark Neal was the host. So Mark Neal, at that time, was sort of one of the top comics in the country. He was slick, smooth, and the Dougs had their own, following. They were sort of out there. And I basically did, it was my first stage performance, but doing basically a busking gig. And I adjusted it for the stage, but that was my kind of break onto the stage. And it wasn't long after that I thought, right, well, now I kind of can see a future in performing on stage, and I gradually just sort of let the busking go. Yeah,
right. Now, you mentioned earlier that you worked on Humphrey B. Bear. Here's Humphrey, I think the name of the show was, which I grew up with. I imagine that's where Pate Biscuit came to play, or she was the competitor, wasn't she? She was at Fat Cat, I believe, or the origin. Patsy Bisco, yes.
Patsy Bisco, the origin, she was on Fat Cat.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I loved doing Humphrey Bear, despite my nervousness at the audition for that gig, I didn't even realize it was an audition to be on. I thought it was just me singing a song.
Right.
Because someone saw me on the street and said, you should go to Channel 9 and do this. They're looking for people. And I thought, I'll just go and sing a song. That's fine. but that was actually to become a presenter. And I was so nervous. Being in the street is great, because you kind of feel at home there. I do, but going into a TV studio was like very confronting for me.
Yeah.
But when I got the gig, and so there was always two presenters, usually a guy and a girl, sometimes two girls, sometimes two guys. And our job was to interact with the bear and be his voice. So we'd interpret what he would say when the mouth was flapping, and follow a theme. But I found that with a lot of the presenters, they became, let's just say, to be kind, they spoke down to the children.
You want to say condescending, don't you? But you're being polite.
And a bit patronising, and kids hate that.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I thought to myself, why does her voice change when she's talking to the child at home? And what's all that about? Rather than speaking in your normal voice, like you would to, a normal person.
Yeah.
And I think kids picked up on it, and the fake laughter and all of that. So Pate was all that I think is bad in children's presenting. But she was also quite cruel, and I'm sure into S&M.
Yeah. Nice one. Snuck that one in. Yeah. Did she ever see the light? Did that character ever see the busking space? Or was it harder?
No, not really a busking. She's more for the stage. She's been in a few stage shows of mine since the big gig. But the big gig turned Pate into a proper kind of, this proper character that everybody knew and wanted to see, as did Sergeant Smith. They had life before big gig in my stage shows. But when I got to the ABC, they gave me a proper wig and proper makeup. So the character sort of took a step up, so to speak.
Yeah, no, it looks fantastic.
But that's where that character came from. And actually, Sean McAuliffe wrote the very first story that Pate told on the big gig. It was called The Fish That Was Naughty, which is about a white shark eating someone, basically.
Okay, that is naughty. You just mentioned your theatre. So obviously, some people know you as the stand-up comedian, and other people know you as the theatre person, as the thespian. You had a very successful show, Certified Male, which I think you formed here in Australia, and then it went around the world. Is that right? Yeah,
it's still going. We're actually, I'm right now in the middle of negotiations to get it on in the US, which has been many years in the making. So we're expecting that to be on early next year, in either Denver or St. Louis before going into New York.
Yep.
I think the theatre is, particularly shows like Certified Male, to be honest, if I'm talking about, where do my passion really come to life, it is in the theatre.
Yeah.
I find television a bit constricting for me. There's this slight disconnect between myself and the audience, and as any comedian who works live rooms will know, you get a lot of feedback from how the audience are responding, and that sort of gives you a sense of timing and sense of how you're going, whether to speed up or slow down. And so I love writing shows, I love directing, and I love producing, although of late I'm thinking maybe less of the producing and more of just the directing and the writing. But we do have, I think, the potential for Certified Male to become, going into its new phase over the next 10 years. I think it's, I'm feeling quite excited about it because it's still very relevant, that play.
It's funny, and it does, and it talks about, just for those that don't know about it, it talks about men's health, mental health, and stresses and the pressures, and if I'm correct.
Yeah, well, that's right. Those issues are raised, and also about things that men don't generally talk about that we tend to keep secret. Or keep to ourselves, and also just, friendships, relationships with partners, relationships with fathers, relationships with our children, And it's put in the narrative is strong, so it's got a strong through line, and there's a nice sort of catch at the end. There's a nice twist to the story at the end. But I think it's a good story for today. It still has. I mean, we wrote it in 1999 and it opened in 2000 in Melbourne. And it's been in 6 countries. And I think there's going to be, like I said to you, there's going to be this new lease of life for it. We'd love it to run a long time in New York. That would be just excellent. But yeah, it's a nice piece for men and women. Women actually probably buy more of the tickets for it than men do.
Yeah. Oh, good. Does it give them a window into their partner to better understand, or what type of woman? Yeah,
it's really interesting. I mean, for me, it's got to be, the golden rules of putting anything on the stage is it can't be boring, right? And in my case, it's got to be funny. So the lubricant is the comedy, but the truth that lies underneath it is actually, it covers some quite serious issues. And the women, we used to get when the show was running, we used to get a lot of emails from women and letters saying how much that they did appreciate seeing, because it did give them an insight into what their men folk are, sometimes going through, or what it is for them in a relationship. I remember we got one beautiful letter from a woman who hadn't seen the show. The show was touring Australia. It was in Newcastle. And she wrote to us saying, I want to thank you for putting the show on last night in Newcastle. I didn't see it, but my former husband did. Yeah. We separated, or we divorced 15 years ago when our child died of SIDS, sudden immune syndrome. And we haven't spoken since. And he saw your play last night. He called me up this morning and he was crying and he said he was sorry.
Wow.
We're going out for dinner tonight. And I thought, wow, how beautiful is that? That for me is, one of the main reasons for putting a show on, so that, because it gives you some, life is not easy, and theatre should be about, holding up a mirror and giving you a reflection of what it is to be a human being. So I do love the power that theatre has, because you never know how it's going to affect people. Yeah, no, agree with that. So we just talked about your different comical outlets, from stand-up, busking, the big gig, and now that tear-jerking moment that you just mentioned in your stage show, which I should add is a comedy at the end of the day, right? It is a comedy. Oh, yeah, it has to be comedy.
Obviously, the audience is changing every time that you're putting one of these different shows on, a different variation of Glynn Nicholas. What do you do? How do you prepare? And how important is understanding the audience when you write new material or write new stage shows or perform stand-up comedy?
Well, that's a really good question, Murray, because I get a lot of submissions in terms of scripts for plays and so on, people looking for someone to produce it. Yeah. And I look at, and that's always the first question that I ask. I say, who is your target audience for this? And a lot of writers don't know. Right. Now, that isn't to say that you need to be writing specifically to a demographic or an age group or so on. But you've got to know what the story is and who you want to reach, first of all. So in the case of, say, Certified Male, that show is specifically designed for middle-aged women and men who have been in a relationship, a long-term relationship, for a while, because it's their story. They understand the scenarios. It's not designed for people in their early 20s. Having said that, people in their early 20s, do come along, but that's not the primary, what the story is primarily about. Yeah. So I do think you need to know who your audience is and put resources into it that match that. There's, the LGBTI community, there's a lot of good theatre in that community, but it's not a big audience. It's like, it's at the most 10% of 1% of the population in Australia. So it's not got a big audience. And what I say I'm about to create a new product with this woman who wants to sort of tackle what it is to be a woman these days, and the differences between, how you get treated as a woman and what the conversation is if you're a woman compared to what you're as a man. And she agrees that you don't make it. It can't be. If you want it to be a strong, successful success, it's got to appeal or have elements of it that appeal to the majority of people in our communities.
Right.
And also, some shows, having said that, some shows are better off kept small and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? So you wouldn't go putting them into big venues if they're just a small, sweet, intimate show. So the scale of shows is also very important. And, when you're starting out creating your own shows, you've got to know not only your audience, but also how long can you stay in the correct size theatre without outstaying well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, that's a very good segue to my next question, which is about Song Contest, the Almost Eurovision Experience, which ran at the Alex, I believe, Fitzroy Street, St Kilda.
That's right.
That ran last year?
Yeah, that was a little tryout. We did a little tryout of the show to sort of test all the systems and seeing what worked marketing-wise and seeing if the songs worked. And we now are going to... I'm waiting for confirmation, but it looks like we'll be putting another production of that on in Melbourne next year, followed by a tour.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. And that is kind of a satire, I assume, but by the name of the title.
Yeah,
the Almost Eurovision.
Correct. So there's a lot of humour to be had out of Eurovision.
Yeah, of course.
And Bev Killick plays the host, Bettina Bichikokov from Belarus.
Very good.
And there are 12 countries competing. And the audience votes, so it's like a real Eurovision, but a bit condensed. And the voting is real, but it's always exciting. So you never know on any given night. So there's audience
participation. The audience gets involved.
Yeah. I want it to be the loudest musical in the world, and I'm serious when I say this. I want to be filling stadiums with that in 5 years' time.
Right, I could see this as the next Rocky Horror Picture Show, where you dress up as a.
Well, interesting you should say that, because opening night last year, Richard O'Brien came along, the creator of Rocky Horror, and he loved it.
Right.
And I want to make the show sort of the biggest, loudest musical in the world. That's my mission over the next 5 years. Wow. Because it's very, everybody gets a clacker and a flag, and it's like a cross between a sporting event and a musical.
Yep.
And a rock concert. So it's very loud.
And do you do a cameo in this, or are you on the wings?
No. I was just directing. Yeah.
Oh. Oh, that's good. Exciting. I live in the neighbourhood, so I'll be looking forward to coming along to that show. And if Bev is there again, I know Bev, and she's been interviewed on this podcast as well. Interesting.
Yeah, she's great in the role. She's really good.
There she is. So we've talked about your life as a producer in this case, and also a director. You've just mentioned that you want to be less of a producer, more of a director as well. And you're also a motivational speaker. Let's go back to stand-up comedy. Are you doing any stand-up?
Well, I am,
these days?
because you know what, Maury, I've actually missed the performing. The last 10 years, I kind of promised my kids when they were little that I wouldn't go touring anymore, because I wanted to be around as they were growing up. So I kind of put an end to the touring, performing my shows, in order to be in Melbourne more. But now that they've grown up, I've kind of got the desire back to get on stage. So I've been sneaking out on cruise ships every now and then. I do a cruise ship every couple of months, and I'm really enjoying that. So I'm doing stand-up and just generally sort of messing around on stage. But I'm also now in the midst of creating a new stage show. I'm collaborating with another performer who I can't say who it is yet, but we're working on a stage show for next year. Oh. There's also remember I mentioned Certified Male in the States next year, so I'll be going over there for a while to direct that.
Yes.
And the production of Song Contest. But increasingly getting back, and I'm directing a new play in Sydney this year called, last year I did the Dapto Chaser.
Oh, busy.
Which was a play on at the Griffin Theatre, And now I'm going to be doing a new one called Silent Night, which is absolutely nuts. But it's very funny, but it's also very beautiful. So more directing and more performing in the future for me.
Oh, very good. Well, can I ask a couple of questions as we slowly wrap up this interview about the writing? Now, I understand performing stand-up comedy and writing for a stage show are obviously going to be different, but do you have any tricks or techniques that you use to create comedy and find comedy in simple things?
Look, I don't really. I just, I always really think it's best if you're just starting out and you're write what you know about. And that goes for whether you're writing a song or a stand-up routine or a novel or an essay. If you write what you know about, it's going to ring truer. And for example, I'll give you an example. When we were writing Scott Rankin is a great writer and a great director in his own right. But when we were together writing Certified Male, it came out of a number of issues, but primarily about our own relationships. And I was going through a marriage breakup at the time. So a lot of the angst and the pain that you go through ended up on stage. And the trick is to make it, in this case, the trick was to make that pain, present it in a funny kind of way so that people kind of understood where it's coming from, but they were laughing still. And I think if you can just keep it might be a small world to begin with, especially if you're a young writer. You might think that you've got nothing that you know, but actually you do. There's a lot of experience. And if you draw on whatever level of experience it is that you've got, if you draw on that, that's the place to start. And sometimes when you can see performers, you can almost tell that doesn't quite ring true for them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just doesn't. It's not.
They're
acting.
They're acting.
You don't believe it, and there's nothing worse than watching a performer who's either lifted material from a world that they have nothing to do with, and it might be witty, it might be clever, but it's not. It doesn't ring true. And there has to be a level, it has to come from a place of truth for it to actually work. And you just know when people talk about situations that they've been through, you just know, oh, yes, I've been through something similar. So that's where the recognition comes in from an audience point of view. And it's frustrating because, when you're starting out, you think, well, what do I write about? Or just write about stuff that you know about. If you've got brothers and sisters, write about them, or whatever.
Yeah, good. And you alluded to sort of pain, going through a breakup yourself. Finding comedy in pain, I mean, that seems, well, it's probably medicinal in a way. It's probably good for one's health. But how does one go from, the pain into, and they're obviously two ends of a spectrum, aren't they?
Well, I think you've got to come from a perspective of, in life anyway, when you go through pain, there's got to be a lesson in it. And so if you come from a point of view of bitterness, for example, so when we were writing Certified Male, there was a fair bit of bitter stuff in there. So we had to, over time, get rid of the bitter and just go back to, okay, look at it from two perspectives, and find the commonality that most people would find funny in it. Because there's always a fun side. You can go in being, I believe that my mother said to me many years ago, if you can retain two things in your life, you'll be able to get through anything. One of them is a sense of curiosity. In other words, I wonder, what if this happened? And the other is sense of humor. So if you can laugh at yourself and laugh at the situation you're in, no matter what it is, you'll get through everything. I think it was, who was the great philosopher? What's his name? It'll come to me in a second when I'm not thinking. But he told a story, true story, because he went through Auschwitz, the concentration camp. And he said the ones who survived, the inmates who survived, were not the ones who were blaming and complaining and saying, why should this be happening to us? But they're the ones who had a sense of humor. So he told a story of the Germans used to, or the Nazis, not the Germans, the Nazis used to feed them soup, right? With maybe one piece of carrot and one pea in the whole big container of soup. And one of the inmates would get the pea, you know, and the others would say, trust Levi, he gets the pea every time, you know. So they laughed about it rather than complaining about it. So that is, I think, the way to get through pain in life, to see the fun side and to say, well, look, it isn't always going to stay like this, and I'm going to learn something from it. What can I learn? In other words, what if I do this differently next time? And that's comedy, that's theatre, you know, and that's the purpose of it all. I think comedians, actors, I think they're doing the most important job in the world, you know, because they have an audience for a moment in time, and they're speaking some humanity, you know, some truth about life, and that's why we love it. We need to laugh. We need to have a collective laugh. And so to any, you know, up-and-coming comics, comedy actors, stand-ups who are listening, I would say it's really important what you're doing, especially these days, now more than ever. You know, we need the ability to hear people who are going to make us see the funny side of things.
Yeah, that's wise. Wow, very deep. Yeah. Thanks, Glynn. That's good.
That's no worry.
Well, you've mentioned what you're up to, and you've talked about your busy schedule. If someone wants to get in contact with you, perhaps they want you as a motivational speaker. Clearly, you've got some great stories that would motivate and inspire organisations, businesses, or if they want to get involved and have you as a stand-up or invite you to be involved. How do they get in contact with Glynn Nicholas?
The easiest thing to do is to go to the website, which is www.glynn-nicholas.com. And there is a contact form there, and that will come through in an email to me.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned something out of this, and you've been very gracious with your time. Thank you very much for sharing that, Glynn. I do go to the gym at MSAC, which is in Albert Park. So you mentioned you almost got blown away this morning. I might see you.
Okay, mate. All right, good. Enjoy your workout.
Well, cheers, mate. Thanks very much for your time, and we look forward to when the next show, Song Contest, is back in 2018.
Thank you very much for that. I look forward to it too.
Cheers. Thanks, Glynn.
Okay, see ya.